Has delaying the attack on the Islamic Republic by United States and Israel weakened the regime in Iran, or has it strengthened the regime in Iran? I've been asked that question in our discussion group, and my response was really appreciated by the members in the group. So I thought I'd come here and share it with you. And the answer is actually both. In many ways, it has weakened the regime, and in some other ways, it has strengthened it. And the net result depends on evaluating which has been more. So I'm going to go over all the ways the regime has been weakened more because of the delayed attack, and the other ways that it has used the delay as an advantage to strengthen itself, and see at the end whether we could actually figure out the net result in this. We're going to look at all the advantages and disadvantages that this delay has, not just for the regime, but for the American and Israeli coalition. But also we're going to look at it from the Iranian people perspective and how this has affected them, because many of these conversations doesn't include the Iranian people themselves. We should keep reminding people that they need to be included in all of this conversation. My name is Armin Navabi. I'm an Iranian political analyst with decades of experience fighting the Islamic regime inside and outside of Iran. Let's first look at all the ways that the regime in Iran has taken advantage of the delay to strengthen itself. Then we'll go all the ways that the delay has weakened the Islamic regime even more. But first, let's look at the strength. The first thing that we need to take into account is that even though the naval blockade on the Iranian ports have been very successful, and on top of that, the rest of the Operation Economic Fury by Scott Bessent has devastated the regime because of all the financial institutions and all the other loopholes that the Islamic regime used to take advantage of to bypass the sanctions and all of the crypto wallets that have been taken over by United States. That has been very effective. However, the regime still has ways, much less than before, but ways to sell its oil via land routes. Some ships do get through. Again, this is much more limited than before, and the regime is hurting. But there is some revenue here that the regime still has, and also it sells its oil internally for internal consumption as well. So there is some revenue here where, even though it is a fraction of what it used to have, it's still enough to pay for drone components that the regime is buying from Russia and missile components that the regime is buying from China. And the missile and drone building, and they build these very rapidly because they're cheap. They don't have to be very effective. They don't have to be very precise. They don't have to have a lot of explosive power, because when it comes to trying to damage global economy, being a threat to ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz, being a threat to the economic model of, for example, the UAE, as long as the threat is there, as long as there are missiles and drones going towards these commercial ships, going towards Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, especially the UAE, that will be devastating from a commercial perspective. Commercial entities are a lot more risk averse than military ones, and that's why the types of missiles and drones that the Islamic Republic needs to build in a short amount of time on a high scale is doable with not that much of a budget. So that's one thing that the Islamic Republic has done during this ceasefire. Another thing that people need to take into account is that when it was said that the Islamic Republic has lost 90% of its missile launching capacity, it didn't mean that 90% of its missiles and missile launchers have been destroyed. Because then the news came out that 30 out of 33 missile cities underground, under the mountain missile cities of the Islamic Republic are now operational again. And people were thinking that this contradicts earlier reports that the 90% of their missile launching capacity have been destroyed. But this is not a contradiction. What happened during the war is that the United States and Israelis were very effective at closing the entrances to these missile cities. The missile cities themselves that the Islamic Republic has is under layers and layers of granite, and these are just naturally made layers of granite in these mountains that has taken millions of years for them to be like this, and it takes an unimaginable amount of explosive power to be able to get through it. And the Islamic Republic has taken advantage of this naturally made barrier. And even with American bunker busters, it's really hard to get to these missile cities. But as difficult as it is to destroy these missile cities, it's actually quite easy to just blow up their entrances and make them unusable every time we go to war with the regime. But as easy as it is for the Americans and Israelis to close their entrances, it's also not that difficult during ceasefire for the regime to reopen them. And that means that the firepower that was required to close the entrances didn't actually destroy the missiles and the missile launchers in these missile cities deep underground or under these mountains. So they're still there and available to be used by the regime. By the way, on the side note, the regime reported at some point when the Americans closed the entrances to these cities, there was no air coming in and everybody inside suffocated and died slowly. This is something many Iranian people appreciated because of everything that the Islamic regime had done to them. A lot of new data shows that these missile cities are now, most of them are operational again. So that's the bad news, that the ceasefire gave the regime the opportunity to open the entrances again. However, this also means that it's really easy for the Americans and Israelis to just close their entrances every time we go back to war with the regime. These missile cities might be operational, but what's the point where it's just right before the next attack, the Americans and Israelis could just go and close their entrances once more, and now you lost access, and this way you lose access to your missile city every time you need them. Every time the Americans and Israelis want to attack, the first thing they're going to do is just close their entrances with much lower explosive power. So yeah, they might have reopened them, but they could also just close them again. But I did need to include this in the list of the things that the regime has done to recover during the ceasefire. The next thing on the list where the regime has done to recover and regain strength during the ceasefire is that they have now learned from their mistakes. They learned how to suppress the Iranian people. Now, with more information of what it looks like for the Iranian people to do a mass uprising in the millions, that information is going to be used by the Islamic Republic to try to more effectively suppress the Iranian people in the next uprising. Every time the Iranian people do an uprising, the Islamic Republic previously has learned from it, has created new institutions based on it, has created new forces, new training, new methods, new intelligence gathering operations, and as the Iranian people keep getting better with their uprising in size and also in method, the regime has also been very effective. In fact, this is one of the main things that the Islamic regime is good at, is brutally suppressing the Iranian people. And they learn every single time based on their previous experience, and they adjust to it. So I'm very sure that the regime during the ceasefire has created new operational tactics and methods to be more cruel, to be more effective for the next uprising of the Iranian people with limited power. They also have gotten a lot more information regarding which of their forces are not willing to shoot at the Iranian people and which of their forces had no problem and were as cruel as necessary to get this done. They also had more experience with using terrorist proxies like Hashd al-Shabi from Iraq, Zainabiyun from Pakistan, and Fatimiyun from Afghanistan. They also saw how effective they are. And again, that is not that expensive. The Islamic regime is still, even with the blockade, will be able to make enough money to pay armed forces to shoot at the Iranian people and do mass slaughter for suppressing an uprising. And because of what they saw the Iranian people can do, they're adjusting their strategies. They have spent all this time during the ceasefire to figure out their strategies on how to deal with the next uprising. This probably includes relying more on proxy groups outside of Iran, figuring out within the regime which one of their own armed forces are more reliable to kill the Iranian people. But also a cheaper method is to now recruit a civilian part of the population that is pro-regime to arm them, and the most radical people within pro-regime people figure out if they could arm them without paying them and use them against the Iranian people as well. The next thing that the Islamic regime has done to take advantage of the ceasefire is to use these delays by Americans to suggest to their supporters that the reason behind their delays is because the Americans find the Islamic regime to be too powerful and impossible to topple. It will be used as a way to suggest to their followers that we told you that we are stronger than people claim, that we are a force to be reckoned with. So this is used as a way to embolden their base of support and use the delays as evidence that they are on the right side. And because the regime supporters are attracted to strength and they get turned off by humiliation that comes from weakness. The delays are important to be used by the regime as a propaganda tool to advertise strength to their supporters. The last point is obvious. The regime has been trying to hurt the global economy. It has been trying to hurt U.S. economy, but they haven't been very successful at that. It's true that in America, people are complaining about gas prices, but the U.S. economy, it is not at all suffering in the way that the regime was hoping that blockade on the Strait of Hormuz would have caused. But many other countries are suffering, especially the Arab countries around the Persian Gulf. They cannot tolerate this. The Islamic regime was hoping that this would mean that they would be lobbying the United States to stop the military operations for, at least with the UAE. This has had the opposite effect, obviously, but there are also other countries, the European countries, Japan, South Korea. These are all considered allies of the United States, and the regime has been hoping that the economic hurt that these countries are feeling would make them pressure President Trump to give up. And obviously that pressure is there. It's not like this hasn't been successful at all, but it hasn't been nearly as successful as the Islamic Republic was hoping. But given that pressure does exist, we need to include it in this list. So now going to all the ways that the delay has actually hurt and weakened the Islamic regime and has actually been helpful to the Americans and Israelis. The obvious ones are that the soldiers need recovery time. This is something that a lot of people underestimate and don't know how important it is, but based on listening to all the experts, apparently this is really important. And also restocking interceptors and other military assets during this time has been very important. Speaking of assets, the United States has brought a lot more naval assets to the region, even more than what they had before the beginning of Operation Epic Fury. So that means if we go to war against the regime again, the firepower that the United States has access to right now is much more significant than compared to what they had for Operation Epic Fury. So that is not good at all for the regime. Another obvious point is that the naval blockade has been devastating to the regime. It has been very effective. It's really difficult for the regime to right now find a way to pay for all the expenses that need to be paid to keep it stable. But on top of that, the blockade, even though it has been very successful, the main success of the blockade will show itself if it continues for a few months. All of the economic damage that this has done to the regime is very insignificant to the damage that it could do to the regime if it goes on like this for a few more months and the blockade continues to be successful as it has been so far. Another thing that a lot of people don't understand or underestimate is that during ceasefire, the internal fighting within the regime escalates and it causes a lack of unity. It causes a lack of ability to do proper decision making. The internal politics of the regime gets really chaotic during ceasefire. During military operations, there's a way for pro-regime people to get united. And again, please don't use the rally around the flag effect, because the vast majority of the Iranian people will never support this regime, especially after what they did in early January, but even before. But after early January, any Western commentator telling you that there's a rally around the flag effect has no idea what the hell they're talking about. The Iranian people consider themselves to be occupied by this regime. They don't see this regime as Iranian at all. So none of these military operations is making the Iranian people come back to the regime. When I talk about unity, I'm talking about the unity in the minority pro-regime people, pro-regime Iranians, and the regime itself, and the politicians and the military people within the regime themselves. Within the pro-regime people, during the ceasefire, there's a lot of internal fighting and division and backstabbing. And during military operations, there's some excuses for unity. So this ceasefire has caused a lot of damage to the alignment of the regime officials. And this internal division is more damaging to the regime than a lot of people realize. Going now to the Iranian people, the ceasefire has been devastating. Every single Iranian that I talk to from Iran, they cannot wait for the Americans and Israelis to attack again. And the blockade, even though the Iranian people want the blockade to continue because it hurts the regime, however, it has caused their lives to be very difficult. Food is very expensive. Doctor visits is very expensive. Medicine is very expensive. Simple operations are very expensive. A lot of middle class and even upper middle class people are finding it very difficult to make ends meet. And then on the other hand, we also have a lot of anger. The rage continues to increase. The Iranian people have not forgotten and will never forget what the regime has done to them, even though the past 47 years has been devastating and the regime has been extremely cruel for the past 47 years. What happened in early January adds so much on top of that rage. And also after what the massacre of early January, the regime supporters being in the streets every day since the beginning of the ceasefire and protesting and chanting in favor of the regime has increased the level of rage. I know that because I get so many messages from inside Iran every time they find a way to get connected to the internet. They can't wait to go back to the streets and do their uprising against the regime. The message I get from the Iranian people is that last time we came out to protest, the next time we come out, we're going to come out to kill. A lot of people don't understand how these daily protests by pro-regime people, how much that is adding to the rage of anti-regime Iranians against them. The regime might have been miscalculating when it comes to these protests. They had these pro-regime protests into the streets as a way to try to avoid an uprising. But what they might have done, instead of increasing fear among anti-regime Iranians, they managed to increase anger. So that, I think, is the most complete list of how the ceasefire is affecting everybody. I do think the net balance is that the regime has been weakened because of the ceasefire, but I also do think enough is enough. Especially me as an Iranian speaking, it's really hard for me to tolerate the Iranian people suffering the way that they're suffering right now, even though I understand that military operations are complicated and sometimes proper planning and time is required to do it right. But I also hope that people understand why, from the perspective that this just needs to end already. Some people might disagree with how, based on everything that I said, that whether the delay has been more helpful to the regime or not, or has weakened the regime. But one thing I want to add, and I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think it's important to mention this every time. One thing that would guarantee that the net effect on the regime is negative against them is to arm the Iranian people. There's no better return on investment when it comes to a military plan that weakens the regime. You get the most bang for your buck, literally, if you arm the Iranian people. If you calculate any other military plan, the costs associated with it and the damage it does to the regime, nothing could compete with arming the Iranian people. I don't want to make this video too long, so if you want to talk to me in more detail about this topic and all other political related topics, come join our discussion group. I'm there almost every day. It's not just me, there's so many other interesting people there that you could come and talk to. The link is in the description and or in the bio, and you could also get there by scanning the QR code on the screen. My name is Armin Navabi. I'm Israel Chai. Long live America. Javid Shah. Payande Iran.